A horrifying orange glow reflected in Karen's kitchen window. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against bone. She yanked the curtains open, her breath hitching in her throat. Her prized vintage Schwinn, the one she'd painstakingly restored, was engulfed in flames. The flames licked at the night, casting grotesque shadows that danced across her manicured lawn. Fury, raw and immediate, washed over her. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately torched her bike. But why? Her eyes darted to the curb, landing on the crudely spray-painted message on the pavement. Join or else. The HOA. It had to be them. Just last week, she'd had a heated confrontation with Mr. Henderson, the HOA president, over her refusal to pay their exorbitant beautification fees. He'd been insistent, his smile strained, his eyes cold. "It's for the good of the community, Karen," he'd said, his voice dripping with a veiled threat. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't about beautification. It was about control. They were willing to resort to arson to intimidate her. A tremor of fear ran through her, but it was quickly eclipsed by a tidal wave of anger. They'd chosen the wrong woman to bully. She wouldn't be intimidated. She would fight back. Snatching her phone, she dialed 911, her voice shaking with barely suppressed rage as she reported the arson. As she spoke, her gaze swept across her neighbors' darkened windows. Were they complicit? Did they know and choose to look away? Or were they too, living in fear of this HOA, afraid to stand up for what was right? The wail of sirens split the night, red and blue lights painting the street in an eerie glow. The fire truck pulled up, a behemoth of metal and flashing lights, followed closely by a police cruiser. As the firefighters battled the blaze, 2 officers approached, their faces grim. "Can you tell us what happened, ma'am?" the older officer asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Karen pointed to the smoldering remains of her bike, then to the graffiti on the curb. "They set my bike on fire," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "The HOA. They threatened me." The officers exchanged a look, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. "The HOA." The younger officer scoffed. "That's ridiculous, ma'am. We'll need a statement." He reached for his notepad, a dismissive air settling around him. Frustration gnawed at Karen. They didn't believe her. They were dismissing it as a prank, refusing to see the danger. She had to find a way to make them understand, to prove that this was just the beginning. Then, as the older officer turned back to inspect the charred bike, something glinting on the grass caught Karen's eye. It was a small gold button, partially hidden in the grass, reflecting the flashing lights, and it looked awfully familiar. Karen crouched down, heart pounding, and carefully picked up the button. It was identical to the ones on the HOA president's prized blazer, the one he wore to every meeting, practically bursting with self-importance. A slow, grim smile spread across her face. They'd made a mistake, a big one. The younger officer, noticing her movements, strode over, his face etched with impatience. "Ma'am, we need you to." Karen cut him off, holding up the button. "This," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and triumph. "This was found near my burning bike. It belongs to Mr. Henderson, your HOA president." The officers exchanged a startled look. The younger one opened his mouth to speak, but the older one silenced him with a look. He took the button from Karen, examining it closely under the flashing lights. "This doesn't prove anything, ma'am," he said finally, his tone cautious. "It could have fallen off any time." "Oh, really?" Karen challenged. "Then perhaps you should also know that Mr. Henderson came to my house just this afternoon, threatening me, trying to intimidate me into joining his little club." The officers' expressions turned serious. They spoke in hushed tones, then the older one turned back to Karen. "We'll look into this, ma'am," he said, his voice now laced with a newfound respect. "But we need a formal statement. Everything you've told us in detail." As Karen recounted the afternoon's encounter with Mr. Henderson, the veiled threats, the barely concealed hostility, she noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The officers' skepticism was replaced by a wary curiosity. They listened intently, taking detailed notes. One of them spoke into his radio, requesting backup and an evidence team to search the area. Just as Karen finished her statement, a sleek black SUV pulled up behind the police cruiser. A tall, imposing woman emerged, her face etched with concern, her eyes immediately finding Karen. She walked with a purposeful stride, stopping in front of Karen and extending a hand. "Karen?" she asked, her voice firm yet kind. "I'm Detective Miller. I understand you have information about the fire." Karen shook her hand, a surge of hope rising within her. This felt different. This felt like the cavalry had arrived. "I do, Detective," Karen replied, fixing her gaze on the detective's sharp, intelligent eyes. "And I believe this is just the tip of the iceberg." Detective Miller possessed a quiet authority that instantly put Karen at ease. She listened intently as Karen recounted the HOA's escalating harassment, the threatening letters, the accidental damage to her property, and the whispers, always the whispers, branding her a troublemaker for refusing to conform. "They even went after my roses," Karen said, her voice trembling with remembered fury. "Claimed they were an inch too tall and blocked the sidewalk. 2 decades those roses have bloomed, and suddenly they're a problem." Detective Miller's expression hardened. "This isn't about roses, Karen," she stated, her voice firm. "This is about power and control. They tried to intimidate you, and when that didn't work," she gestured towards the smoldering remains of the schwinn, "they escalated." "But why?" Karen cried, frustration lacing her voice. "It's just an HOA. What could they possibly gain from all this?" Detective Miller's eyes held a knowing glint. "You'd be surprised," she said cryptically. "People in power, even on a small scale, rarely relinquish it willingly. They get a taste of control, and they crave more." She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. "I'm requesting a warrant," she announced, her voice clipped and professional. "We're going to pay Mr. Henderson and his board members a visit." A surge of satisfaction coursed through Karen. Finally, someone was taking her seriously. As Detective Miller barked orders into her phone, the street seemed to buzz with activity. More police cars arrived, their flashing lights painting the night in pulsating red and blue. Forensics officers, clad in white jumpsuits, swarmed the charred remains of her bike, their movements precise and efficient. Suddenly, a shriek pierced the night. A young officer, kneeling by the curb, shouted something, waving a small plastic bag. He hurried towards Detective Miller, his face pale. "Ma'am," he said, his voice hushed, "we found this near the graffiti. It's a gasoline canister." Detective Miller's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint flickering within them. "And it gets better," the officer continued, holding up the bag. "We got a partial fingerprint." A wave of nausea washed over Karen. This wasn't just vandalism. It was arson, a serious crime. As Detective Miller took the evidence bag, her eyes met Karen's, her expression unreadable. "Looks like we're just getting started," she said, her voice cold and steady. The arrival of the forensics team transformed her quiet cul-de-sac into a scene ripped straight from a crime drama. Floodlights illuminated the night, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced with the swaying trees. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, peered out from behind curtains, their faces a mixture of curiosity and fear. Detective Miller, now joined by a team of officers, prepared to descend upon Mr. Henderson's house. Karen, watching from her driveway, felt a strange mix of trepidation and exhilaration. Justice was coming, but at what cost? Just as the officers were about to move, a loud, indignant voice shattered the tense silence. "What in the blue blazes is going on here?" Mr. Henderson stood on his porch, a silk robe hastily pulled over his pajamas, his face a mask of outrage. He looked from the officers to Karen, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "This is harassment," he boomed, his voice dripping with indignation. "I demand to know what you're doing on my property." Detective Miller, unfazed by his bluster, approached him, warrant in hand. "We have reason to believe you're connected to a crime, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Arson, to be precise." Mr. Henderson scoffed, a dismissive wave of his hand. "Arson? Preposterous. I'm a respected member of this community." Detective Miller's lips twitched into a wry smile. "Respect is earned, Mr. Henderson," she countered. "And right now, you're not earning any. Read the warrant." As Mr. Henderson fumed over the warrant, his face turning an impressive shade of puce, Detective Miller turned her attention to Karen. "We may need you to come down to the station, Karen," she said, her tone softening slightly. "We need a formal statement for our records." Karen nodded, a surge of anxiety tightening her chest. She'd never been to a police station before. The thought of facing Mr. Henderson and his cronies, even with the law on her side, sent a shiver down her spine. As she climbed into the back of the police cruiser, she glanced back at Mr. Henderson, still ranting on his porch, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, she saw a flicker of something cold and calculating beneath the anger. It was a look that sent a chill through her, a look that whispered of battles yet to be fought. The police station was a sterile, brightly lit space that hummed with quiet activity. Officers hurried through the hallways, their voices low and urgent as they spoke into their radios. The air was thick with a palpable tension that seemed to cling to Karen like a second skin. Detective Miller led her to a small, windowless interrogation room, the walls painted a depressing shade of beige. The only furniture was a steel table and 3 uncomfortable-looking chairs. Karen sank into one of the chairs, her anxiety growing with every tick of the clock on the wall. Detective Miller, sensing her unease, offered her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Karen," she said, her voice kind. "This is just procedure. We need to get your statement on record." She placed a recording device on the table, then turned to Karen, her expression turning serious. "Tell me everything you know about the HOA, Karen. Start from the beginning." And so Karen did. She spoke of the seemingly innocuous HOA meetings that had slowly morphed into displays of power and control. She told the detective about the ever-increasing fees, the absurd rules, and the subtle but persistent harassment directed at anyone who dared to question the HOA's authority. "They were like sharks in pastel cardigans," Karen said, her voice trembling with remembered anger. "Smiling to your face while they picked your bones clean." Detective Miller listened patiently, her pen scribbling furiously across her notepad. She asked pointed questions, prompting Karen to recall specific incidents, names, dates. Details that had become lost in a blur of frustration and anger. As Karen spoke, she began to realize the extent of the HOA's control over their community. It wasn't just about lawn ornaments and paint colors. It was about wielding power over their neighbors, about dictating their lives. And those who refused to comply, like Karen, became targets. Did anyone else ever come forward with complaints? Detective Miller asked, her eyes fixed on Karen's. Karen hesitated, a memory flashing through her mind. An elderly woman, Mrs. Johnson, had once approached her after an HOA meeting, her eyes filled with tears. She'd whispered about unfair fines, about harassment, about her fear of speaking out. She was too scared, Karen whispered, her voice heavy with regret. They'd targeted her before, spread rumors, vandalized her property. She didn't want to make waves. Detective Miller's expression hardened. "Do you know what happened to Mrs. Johnson, Karen?" she asked, her voice barely a murmur. Karen shook her head, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. "She sold her house a few months ago," she replied. "Moved in with her daughter out of state. She said she couldn't take it anymore." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the rhythmic whir of the recording device. Detective Miller's silence was more unsettling than any interrogation tactic. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on Karen, a mixture of empathy and steely resolve in her eyes. "Karen," she began, her voice soft yet heavy with unspoken implications. "Mrs. Johnson passed away last month." Karen gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Passed away? But how?" Mrs. Johnson, though elderly, had always been full of life, her spirit undimmed. "Heart attack," Detective Miller said, her gaze unwavering. Her daughter found her clutching a stack of HOA violation notices. They were demanding she replace her roof, said it clashed with the community aesthetic. The blood drained from Karen's face, leaving her lightheaded. They had hounded that poor woman, literally bullied her to death. Rage, raw and potent, surged through her, battling with the sickening guilt of her own inaction. "They can't get away with this," she whispered, her voice trembling with fury. "We have to stop them." Detective Miller nodded grimly. "That's why we're here, Karen. But we need more than your testimony. We need concrete evidence. Proof that links the HOA's actions to a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and potential criminal activity." She leaned forward, her gaze boring into Karen's. "Think, Karen. Did they ever target anyone else? Were there any other incidents?" Karen racked her brain, desperate to unearth something, anything, that could help Detective Miller build a case. Then, a memory flickered at the edge of her mind. The annual block party 3 summers ago. The Johnsons had hosted, their backyard transformed into a festive gathering place. The music, Karen breathed, her eyes widening as the memory sharpened. The HOA shut down the party, claimed it violated noise ordinances. Detective Miller sat up straighter, her eyes gleaming with interest. "Go on." "They slapped the Johnsons with a hefty fine," Karen continued, her voice gaining strength. "And the worst part, they'd hired their own DJ, blasting music until midnight the previous week for the HOA president's birthday. No fines, no complaints. Nothing." A slow, satisfied smile spread across Detective Miller's face. "Looks like we just got our smoking gun, Karen." Karen's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle of the HOA's hypocrisy. The block party incident, Mrs. Johnson's whispers of other victims, the constant veiled threats. It all pointed to a calculated campaign of control disguised as community betterment. Detective Miller, sensing a breakthrough, didn't rush Karen. She waited patiently, allowing the silence to amplify the weight of each revelation. Finally, Karen spoke, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and dawning realization. "The HOA controls the contractors," she said, her eyes widening as the pieces clicked into place. "Landscaping, roofing, even the security patrol. They recommend them, they endorse them, and they punish anyone who uses someone else." "Go on," Detective Miller urged, her pen poised above her notepad. "It's a kickback scheme," Karen breathed, her voice gaining strength with each word. "They inflate the prices, steer residents to their chosen contractors, and line their own pockets with the profits. And if you complain," she shuddered, remembering Mrs. Johnson's fate. "They silence you," Detective Miller finished, her voice steely calm. "With fines, with harassment, with whatever it takes." She stood abruptly, her expression grim. "This changes things, Karen. We need to expand our investigation, bring in the fraud department." She glanced at the clock on the wall. "It's late. I'm going to have an officer take you home. Get some rest. We've got a lot of work to do." Karen wanted to argue, to stay and help, but the events of the night had taken their toll. Exhaustion tugged at her eyelids, and a wave of dizziness washed over her as she stood up. She nodded wearily, her defiance momentarily eclipsed by a bone-deep fatigue. As the officer drove her home, the streetlights cast long, dancing shadows on the sidewalk, reminding her of the grotesque figures that had danced in the glow of her burning bike. But this time, the fear was gone, replaced by a steely determination. Pulling into her driveway, she noticed a group of her neighbors gathered across the street, their faces illuminated by the flashing lights of a news van. They turned, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, as Karen stepped out of the police car. One of them, a young woman Karen vaguely recognized as a new resident, tentatively approached her. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "We saw the news. About the fire. About the HOA." Karen took a deep breath, a surge of newfound strength coursing through her. "I'm fine," she said, her voice firm and clear, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her neighbors. "But our community isn't, and it's time we did something about it." The arrival of the news van was like a crack in the wall of silence that the HOA had erected around their community. As Karen spoke to the young woman, more neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the flickering blue and red lights, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. Word of the arson, the police investigation, and the allegations of corruption had spread like wildfire through the quiet streets. The once invisible lines of fear that the HOA had so carefully drawn were beginning to blur, replaced by a shared sense of outrage and a glimmer of hope. "We knew something was wrong," a voice piped up from the back of the group. It was Mr. Garcia, an elderly widower who had always kept in himself, his head perpetually bowed under the weight of HOA fines. But nobody dared to speak up. "They threatened us with lions, with legal action, with ruining our credit scores," another neighbor chimed in, her voice trembling with remembered fear. "We felt powerless." Karen looked around at her neighbors, their faces illuminated by the flashing lights, and saw not fear, but a growing anger, a simmering rebellion that was ready to boil over. The HOA had made a fatal mistake by targeting her. They had underestimated her tenacity, her refusal to be bullied, and most importantly, her ability to unite their community. "They may have taken my bike," Karen said, her voice ringing with newfound authority, "but they won't take our voices. We're not afraid anymore." The next morning, the fightback began. News vans lined their once peaceful street, cameras capturing the image of a community rising up against tyranny. Neighbors, emboldened by Karen's courage, came forward with their own stories of harassment, extortion, and intimidation at the hands of the HOA. The police, armed with fresh evidence and a growing list of witnesses, raided the HOA's office and the homes of the board members, uncovering a treasure trove of incriminating documents, financial records detailing the kickback scheme, and even threats directed at Karen and other residents who had dared to question their authority. The scandal rocked the community, sending shockwaves through the seemingly idyllic facade of manicured lawns and pastel-colored houses. The HOA president, stripped of his power and facing a slew of charges, could only watch in stunned silence as the life he had built on a foundation of fear and intimidation crumbled around him. Life wouldn't magically revert back to normal. The scars of the HOA's reign would linger. But as Karen surveyed her street, now bustling with neighbors organizing a community barbecue, a genuine smile spread across her face. They had faced down their fears, found their voices, and emerged from the ashes of a single, burned bicycle, stronger and more united than ever before. And that, Karen knew, was a victory worth fighting for.